The coronavirus spread is taking its toll on Chinese economy. This comes at a time when China and the U.S. just signed a Phase 1 trade deal. Could this affect future negotiations? Earlier on the sidelines of the World Economic Forum, I talked to Martin Wolf, the chief economics commentator of the Financial Times. Let's hear what he has to say about China-U.S. trade and his view on the Chinese economy. I've been a fan of your articles. Earlier, you already mentioned the downslope tendency of great powers can be very fast. Apparently, that has been the case between China and the United States over the past 2 years. Tell me more about what do you read out of this process?
Well, I suppose there's a very big story, and then there are lots and lots of individual events within it. And the big story, obviously, is fundamental shift in global power. They have become increasingly equal powers. In some dimensions, the United States remains significantly more powerful than China. In other respects, China is now a real match. This has happened very quickly. It's been the quickest such shift in relative power that has ever happened. Quite extraordinarily quick. It's really happened over a period of 10 or 15 years. They are trying to adjust to this. Yes. China under Mr. Xi Jinping is clearly more assertive than it was. That's no doubt about that. And the Americans under Mr. Trump are more bellicose, more anxious. And it's not Trump. It's the Americans more broadly. Left and right are beginning to feel China cheats. They feel that China is doing too well. China is a technological threat. It's a military threat.
And the list goes on.
And the list goes on. And they are moving towards, they haven't got towards a view that somehow this has to be stopped. Now, that's the background, the big story. I think this will remain the dominant geopolitical and geoeconomic story for the next half a century in different ways. In that story, of course, there are specific issues, very big issues. The Americans have been particularly concerned under Mr. Trump with the trade relationship. Yeah. That's their catalyst. It's not the only issue. They're also very, very concerned under Mr. Trump, but even more with others in the security side, on the technological independence and technological security of the United States. Those are the big issues now. I think in the trade story, having agreed this first deal, that's quite significant. Not because it's a good deal, it's a terrible deal in my view, but because it indicates something very important, which we weren't sure about, which is that under Trump, who is actually less hawkish, it's very important, Trump is less hawkish than many of the people around him, they want a deal. And that is encouraging because it means they want, under him, to manage relations, not to let them break down.
Hasn't that totally shown the fact that you can't depend on one deal between two important economies or any economies? No. You have to have a mechanism. You have to communicate. You have to go into details of everything on a daily basis in order to get anywhere. So is that deal going to be the very beginning of this mechanism, which used to exist, maybe not to the utmost satisfaction, but still existed? What about now? Do you think it is the beginning, or this is only it?
I'm not sure there will be a second stage deal, so they talk about part one and part two, but the most important point you make, with which I wholly agree, is that this is a step, a stage, in an ongoing process which will go on, as I said earlier, forever. Yeah, I mean, forever, but 50 years, 100 years, in which they will be constantly renegotiating. There will be friction. It will never be smooth, easy, comfortable. And this deal has within it, in its structure, the certainty that there will be further friction.
China-U.S., even GDP-wise, only 40% or less. The other part of the world, yes. The other part of the world, 60, that's 6 zero, majority. So when the two economies are interacting over the past 2 years, the others are watching, including the European Union, even though it is divided also within the entity itself. But what role will, quote unquote, the others play, particularly this big player called the European Union?
The US went out of its way to exclude other big players from their discussions with China. They approached this completely bilaterally. And the Europeans and the Japanese, the other big external power, decided the sensible thing to do is to sit on the sidelines and just see what happens. We don't want to be involved. We don't want to make choices between the two. Let them get on with it. So that's their position. I think the US is beginning to show signs, interesting with a recent deal with the EU and Japan on technology, that they will want to multilateralize it. Because the US, I think, has begun to realize that in dealing with China, they have an important asset, which is allies, potential allies. And this is, of course, very worrying, I know, for the Chinese. They don't want everybody to gang up on them.
Let's talk about the immediacy. Election year. At the same time, during election year, the second stage of China-U.S. trade deal could be difficult. It is also difficult for the others to know where Washington is going, Washington as a whole, and whether the current president will be the president for the next 4 years.
Of course.
So can the other players, the Europeans included, be able to stand by for the rest of the year to see what Washington would come up with?
Yes, I think there is. I expect nothing to happen further this year.
What about 5G? 5G is already there, right? That is in a lot of areas already. If the Europeans wait, it means they might lose 1 year of using 5G in real term. Now, the Americans are already developing their own 5Gs. The Europeans are also trying, but still. So what does that mean near term?
Well, 5G is a very special issue because it involves the security systems. Of course, but the biggest, the country that will be most pressured on this year is Britain. I don't think the Europeans are going to make decisive decisions on 5G this year, and I think it's pretty clear that there will be a role for Huawei in Europe. What its role will be is still open. The British and the Americans are still clearly in conflict over this, and there will be probably, as part of the negotiations between Britain and the US on a post-Brexit relationship, there could well be a decision on Britain's use of Huawei. I don't think the British will very willingly give up Huawei in 5G, but that's a very specific issue. In other trade issues, the Europeans, everybody else will want to sit out the election year, and they think, with the exception of the US-EU relationship, nothing to do with China, the US-EU relationship, where the Americans are going to push, they think that the Americans are not going to drag them in further into issues relating to China. And furthermore, the EU is developing its own policies towards China, but it's quite a long way from deciding what they should be. And at the moment, Mr. Hogan, who is the commissioner, is focusing on the US.
To what extent do you think UK at least aspires to establish or maintain certain kinds of stability in its relationship with the other big economies? I'm not just saying China, China included. And in that way, what does that mean for the UK's choices of policies and also the Europeans' capital's choices of policies?
I have 2 points, one about the relations with China and then a much broader point. Yes. The general position of the Europeans, including the British, the general position is if there is this ongoing friction between the US and China, as far as they're concerned, they're going to do everything they can to avoid having to take sides.
For now.
For now. And but they have some very specific issues with China of their own, and the most important of which are China's role as an investor in Europe. That's very clear, worry for Germany particularly, and China's role, we've already discussed, in technology 5G. Those are issues that are important, and there are a lot of other issues they have with China where their view is very similar to the Americans. Intellectual property and so forth, so they'll be perfectly happy. There are actually, this is important, they are very concerned about the US-China trade deal because it looks as though China will deliver what the Americans want at the expense of Europeans. But I don't expect anything sensationally hot. Now, the other aspect of it, which you raised, you talked about Britain, we are trying to construct a new trade relationship with the world. And from this point of view, it's very, very clear Britain has a ranking of importance, of hierarchy. Right. The most important thing is a new relationship with the European Union. The second most important thing is a new relationship with the United States. And after that come relations with other countries, including China. Right. And I don't expect us to do anything on relations with China as a new trade policy in 2020. That is bound to occur later on.
That's about the immediacy.
Yeah.
What about the mid and long term? How are the Europeans, if I could put them as a whole, think about their overall relationship with the United States, and also the losing of soft power of the U.S., as we have seen, and its credibility over the past few years, fulfilling their obligations, even security-wise, with the Europeans. I'm not trying to divide here, but there's a reality. So how much would that brush or rebrush the thinking style of the European capitals? So the European capitals would only stick to what they believe anyway, and reluctant to change about mindset because it's too complicated, it's too mind-boggling, it's too busy for the Europeans.
Okay, so the broad point is this, and very, very clear. The Europeans don't know yet how deeply this relationship is going to have to change. They don't know with the U.S. They don't know whether the U.S. role in the world and attitudes to the world are going to have changed permanently and fundamentally. They are very, very anxious, very worried about it, but this is incomparably the most important economic, political, and security relationship for the Europeans. Yeah. And they will not change their fundamental strategic orientation, which is towards the Americans, quickly. It will take years, unless something very dramatic happens, and doesn't seem likely. It will take many, many, many years before the Europeans say this relationship is basically gone.
Are they ready to pay the price for that?
I think it's very clear they will not. They will not break with the United States in the near term. There is no possibility they will do so in favor of any other partner, because they don't trust any other partner, and no other partner begins to be as important as the United States. So we should assume that the US-EU relationship will remain the core relationship, at least for quite a few years.
What about stakeholders? Now, the World Economic Forum this year, Martin, is about stakeholders' responsibilities. As we know, this platform has always been to call on the goodness of human beings, of collaboration to start with. But how sustainable this discussion will be given the division of the society?
My assessment is that at this stage it's mostly window dressing. It won't change anything fundamental. Those countries where stakeholder thinking is already deeply embedded in continental Europe, particularly Northern Europe, will remain. In Germany, the Netherlands, Scandinavia, Switzerland, these are important parts of the way they think. The Americans are not going to change. They will remain essentially the same sort of corporations as they've always been. The British are not going to change. So I think it's mostly window dressing. I don't expect a lot of change. But in a few areas, just possibly something will
Like
happen.
what?
I think the climate issue is one in which companies begin to feel that if they don't respond to the pressure, it will be very bad for their relations with their customers, with their workers, with the society. It's like the way people responded to tobacco or the opioid crisis. So I think there are specific areas, and climate is probably the most important now.
We have seen the world embracing different themes. Climate change is the latest. However, at the same time, when we're putting so much emphasis on one issue, there are many other issues that are going on that would need the same, if not more, attention as well. Just one thing, biodiversity vis-a-vis climate change, and not to mention security issues, geopolitics, all of this. So, how much should we put the bread in one basket? And how much should we spread the bread in different baskets? Or will one basket of bread be able to feed all of us?
I suppose my answer would be human beings are very, very bad at doing many things at the same time.
Do I meet another skeptical person right here? As a journalist?
My view is if you're going to make a change, you have to focus on things. I think that at the moment, given the timetable involved and the scale of the challenge, the focus on climate is appropriate. There are all these other issues. Biodiversity is, I think, very important, although they're linked. But I'm perfectly happy if anything happens, which I'm much more skeptical. But I am perfectly happy with the focus, because if you try to do everything, you always end up doing nothing. So in the end, China focused for 40 years on growth. It worked pretty well. You have to focus.